welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. This week we have another visit to the Bacchus Bar in Glasgow, where Glasgow Pensioners for Indy had guest speaker Craig Murray, and it was a very interesting discussion.
Virtually all of you, well, you're bound to know about Craig Murray and who he is and all the things he's done and so on. He's an author, journalist and blogger, former elected rector of Dundee University, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, and he basically lost his job because he blew the whistle on the human rights scandals and abuses that were going on there, and the fact that the UK government was using information which had been got through torture in these areas. He's an activist now for human rights and for freedom of the press and for causes such as Scottish independence. Yes. And he attends events where the information might be suppressed, such as the extradition trial for Julian Assange. Anyway, he is absolutely here, totally fresh from Venezuela, and over to you, Craig.
Thank you. Thank you. I was reflecting this morning on the fact that I think I've definitely got more left wing as I've got older. I think that's in response to world events. I think the things that are happening in the world and the things that are being revealed to us are so awful about how the world is run, and particularly how the Western world is run. And we already knew there were bad things about other parts of the world, but the world we've lived in, I think most of us grew up thinking we lived in a sort of decent, fairly reasonable, international law-abiding, social democratic country. And I think back in the 70s it probably largely was like that. It certainly seemed a much kinder space. And we're all of a certain generation here. And I went to, people think I'm posh. I'm actually not posh. I was the first person in my family to get to university, and I went to university on a full maintenance grant, and my tuition fees were all paid by the government. And I went to university, and on my full grant, I could have a drink most days and live a reasonably good life as a student, and in a society where by and large people were cared for, where by and large the NHS functioned reasonably well, where by and large we didn't have a huge amount of homelessness, we didn't have a huge amount of social conflict. And I think in almost all of those respects, I just watched the world get steadily worse as I've got older. And I don't think this is rose-tinted spectacles looking back at my youth. I don't think it's the common onset of nostalgia. I think we live in a worse society now than we used to live in. We live in a less caring society. We certainly live in a society where poverty is much more obvious. And we live in a society where the gap between rich and poor has grown exponentially. There are several hundred billionaires in the UK, billionaires. And there are millions of children who are not properly fed because their parents are in poverty. And that kind of extraordinary wealth gap, where you have people like Jim Ratcliffe, who's worth something like £15 billion, that's bad enough in itself. When you see things like Grangemouth being closed down so that somebody can make a little more money by doing it in the Netherlands instead. I want to tell you something I saw in Venezuela. And because of problems finding people to edit in particular, there are a lot of videos I've made in Venezuela which are in the pipeline and not out yet, and will be coming out over the next couple of weeks. One thing I visited was the Kelloggs factory there. And Kelloggs had a factory in Venezuela which made cornflakes, you'll be unsurprised to hear. And it made Cocoa Pops and Fruit Loops and those kind of things. And one day in 2018, Kelloggs said, overnight, literally, the factory employed 650 people. Overnight, Kelloggs said, we're closing the factory, we're closing down. Literally, they gave overnight redundancy notices to 650 people and said, we're off. And the Venezuelan government said, okay, don't let the door hit you on the arse on the way out. And they kept the factory open. And the factory is still producing cornflakes to this day. And Kellogg's, of course, said, you can't do that. These are our patented processes. This is our machinery. And the government of Venezuela said, well, anytime you want to come back and reopen the factory, it's all still here. We don't deny you still own it. You're welcome. But you said you didn't want to use it. So we're using it. And it's carried on. And as I say, and I visited it. And I made a little documentary there. But isn't that a wonderful way to react to a multinational company?
Yeah.
Make everyone done and say, OK, off you go. And it works. And that kind of... if you like, socialism in action. And it's now done by, it effectively now functions as a workers' cooperative. And the guy who was the head of the trade union in the factory is now the managing director. It was a very heartening thing to see, and a different way of looking at the world. And I'd like to contrast that to the kind of things we've learned from the Epstein files, which are just shocking. I mean, they're just absolutely, entirely shocking in understanding the social milieu of the ruling class and how these people think and how these people act and how these people treat people. You don't even have to... I'm not going to get into the question of whether or not they reveal Satanism or cannibalism or all the other things people they have seen there. There's certainly some things there which are very, very difficult to explain. But even leaving aside the most extreme edge of it, the way they commodify people, the way they treat people, particularly, obviously, but not only young women, is just astonishing about... And the breadth of it, the fact that almost every big name of a big industrialist you can think of, or big tycoon you can think of, is there, and they were all prepared to go along with it, makes you realise that the people running Western society are just awful. And we live in a system where those who achieve power, either through wealth or through political power, are bad people, because it's being bad people that gets them the wealth and the power. We live in a society that puts a premium on evil, that rewards evil. There's something wrong with that. And we're told that the form of advanced capitalism we have at the moment is the natural order of things, if you like. It's how society naturally orders itself, and that anything else is a distortion. But actually it's not true. The thing that gives Jim Radcliffe £15 billion is a series of laws and rules and accounting conventions, the way that society is built up. It's not the natural order of things at all. It's a system which concentrates wealth and concentrates the benefits of the labour of ordinary people to a very small number of individuals, and which also creates so-called wealth artificially through money which is simply computer-created digits by banks which are funneled towards people. And we saw the state indulging in that in an enormous way by quantitative easing, if you recall. The reaction to the 2008 banking crisis was to create vast amounts of money, which weren't then spent on public services or construction or public housing or any of the things they could have been spent on. They were just pumped into financial institutions and eventually found their way to people like Epstein or Wexner or Radcliffe or any of these other billionaires. We live in a society which is fundamentally wrong. And I can't help but put that together with the demise of law in the international field, the demise of any feeling of principle. I mean, I'm looking at what's happening now in Iran. And it doesn't matter what you think of the government of Iran. Anyone who thinks you make the people of Iran have a better life by bombing them is nuts. And what's happening is massive destruction, and the willingness of the media to all turn out the same nonsense that we know is nonsense about carefully targeted strikes and all of the precision strikes on military installations. I spent 6 months or 5 months, the autumn before last and early spring, in the Lebanon during the crisis there. I went during the actual war and stayed for 3 months of the so-called ceasefire, during which ceasefire there wasn't a single day when Israel didn't bomb, just like the ceasefire in Gaza. And over 100,000 homes were destroyed in southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley and the southern suburbs, exactly the same places they're bombing now. And we were told then, and the media reflected the propaganda, we were told that all of the homes being bombed were all Hezbollah strongholds. It's a good word. Hezbollah strongholds, Hezbollah compounds. These are actually people's homes and apartment blocks. You know, they use these terms in order to justify. And I had the opportunity many times to go to places immediately after they'd been bombed. And if there were any military infrastructure there would be signs of it. You know, there were rocket launchers there. You'd have big bits of metal in the wreckage. And there just never was. On one occasion, literally one occasion out of hundreds, in the 6 months or so I spent there of looking through wreckage, there was one place which had been a rocket launching site. And it wasn't a home, it was a rocket launching site. All the other places I saw were just homes which had been devastated and destroyed. And that's largely what's happening now. You know, when you see, and have you noticed how extraordinarily little material is coming out, how little we are seeing compared to what we used to see, for example, in the early days of Gaza, of the destruction in Tehran, all of the destruction that Iran is causing back, of which there will be some, although Iran is, of course, immensely outmatched militarily. And that's because internet freedom is also vastly constrained now. The main portals of internet freedom, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, they're all concentrated in the hands of a few billionaires, all of whom, must be said because it's simply true, all of whom are absolutely devoted to Israel, all of whom are hardline Zionists. And there's been a deliberate policy of pro-Israeli takeover of the social media gatekeeper sites, the sites we all use in order to get out what we're thinking. And that's why there's so little useful information about what's going on in the Middle East getting through the filters to us at the moment. What do we do about living in this world? You know, what can we do about it? I was instrumental in bringing the genocide case from South Africa to against Israel at The Hague. I was asked by the guy who actually initiated that whole thing, who's not had sufficient credit for it, was a guy called Sam Husseini, who's a journalist based in Washington. And he actually buttonholed me at a Julian Assange event in Washington shortly after the genocide in Gaza started, and asked me why states weren't utilizing the Genocide Convention. And I said, well, I think people just don't think about it. It's not a convention that's been widely used, although it's extremely widely signed up to. And he asked me if I could do a paper on how to use it, which I did, and in fact also published. And that paper was given to the South African government by Andrew Feinstein, who used to be an ANC MP. And Andrew, with a message from Julian Assange in Belmarsh, between Andrew and Stella Assange, they gave it to the South African Foreign Ministry. And I'm proud to say that when South Africa decided to take Israel to the International Court of Justice for genocide, that my paper on how to do it was among the documents on the cabinet table. It's by no means the only document on the table, and their own lawyers did a fantastic job, and the lawyers who've been taking it on have been doing a fantastic job, led by Blinny Negreli, who's also running the English version of the Palestine Action case. But so I was there in The Hague that day for that, and these are things we can do, but you wonder how much good it's done. You know, there was an initial judgment, or an initial court decision, not a judgment, that there was a plausible case that genocide is being committed. Israel was ordered to stop. Israel took no notice of that whatsoever. And the entire Western media entirely misrepresented the content of that interim ruling. And the court, which now has a Japanese president, and the president has a lot of power over the timing and administration, the court has, I think, twice extended the deadline for Israel to respond to the substantive case, and nothing's happening. Meantime, the International Criminal Court, which is the other institution in The Hague, and I should say the day I was there for the ICJ case on genocide, the same day, Hassan Abu Sitta, the director of Glasgow University and famous surgeon, was on his way to the International Criminal Court to swear a deposition on the genocide in Gaza. And I met him there in The Hague. We bumped into each other in Beirut a few months later. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants including for Netanyahu. And yet the international community has ignored that totally. And he appears able to waltz about anywhere he wishes pretty well without being arrested. And now we see almost the only person speaking any sense over the attack on Iran is, funnily enough, the Spanish Prime Minister. And of course, most of us are not naturally incredibly sympathetic to the Spanish Prime Minister because of Catalonia. So there's something of an irony there as well. But the Spanish are doing well. But the reaction of almost all the rest of Europe has been appalling. And all this feeds into, if you like, having come from Venezuela, where you've had a socialist government which was bombed, 200 people were killed almost in Caracas on the 3rd of January. Their president was kidnapped. They have the American fleet just offshore, which is physically stopping any tankers leaving Venezuela unless the oil is sold to the Americans and nobody but the Americans. And strangely enough, that's been portrayed as a voluntary arrangement by the Western media, which it isn't at all. And there is no signed agreement between Venezuela and the Americans to do this. The Venezuelans have absolutely no choice. They've chosen not to fight because they're just in no position to fight the United States. But you know, they just aren't, and I don't blame them for choosing not to fight. What they're doing at the moment is trying not to say anything that will annoy the Americans and hoping that the midterm elections will be lost by Donald Trump and his ability to attack places like Venezuela will be constrained. That's dependent on political developments in the US and Trump's ability to ignore constitutional constraints. I mean, he attacked Iran without getting congressional permission, which he shouldn't have done. He seems to have an ability to simply ride over the Supreme Court, ride over Congress. He's acting in an extraordinary dictatorial way. So I'm not quite sure, even if he does lose the midterm elections, his power will be substantively constrained. We have to see. But the world is changing fast and not in a good way. You know, the vast majority of states in the world are against what is happening. The states in the global south are strongly opposed to what's happening. But we live in a world where there's a resurgence of imperialism, where the United States is prepared to say, it doesn't matter if we don't care what the majority of the country think. We're not concerned about international law. Might is right. We had Marco Rubio make a straight-out defense of the notion of imperialism. to the Munich Security Conference, where he actually blamed the European countries for giving up colonialism extraordinarily. There was an article in the Washington Post about 10 days ago which said that China is essentially defeated, is essentially losing, because it attempted to win influence by trade and investment. And what's the point? Because it's been shown in Panama, for example, that American military power can take away ports from China even if China builds them. And whatever infrastructure in the third world China develops, America can simply seize it using military power. Therefore, China has been outwitted, outplayed, because it's not willing to enter direct military confrontation with the United States. And it's certainly true that China interests me because I don't think there's ever been in history a power which achieved so much economic dominance without seeking territorial expansion. I published that thought a few weeks ago, and some people protested and said, what about Taiwan? What about the Kuril Islands? And a couple of other things. But other than Tibet a generation or two ago, China hasn't sought expansion. And that, I would also say, which may be slightly controversial, but I think isn't actually in doubt, in international law, Taiwan is part of China. In fact, the number of states in the world who acknowledge Taiwan as an independent country is tiny. I actually looked it up the other day, and I can't remember I don't recall how many it was, but it was a dozen or something. Taiwan is not recognized as an independent state widely, including, of course, not recognized by the United Nations. China does not seek to impose its will on the world by military force. The United States does. How this is going to play out in the longer term, I don't know. But the role of the UK remains one of an enabler of the United States, an assistant to the United States, an enabler of the United States, a cheerleader of the United States. I gave an interview from Venezuela to the Tehran Times, which is an English language newspaper in Iran, the day before the United States attacked Iran. And they asked me what I thought the UK would do. They said the UK has said it won't allow any military bases to be used. And I said, well, don't be too thrown off by that. Starmer will have been told by the lawyers that it's against international law, because it plainly is against international law for the United States and Israel to attack Iran. But what they will do is they'll simply, when Iran tries to defend itself, the British will be there shooting down the Iranian missiles and claiming that's not part of the attack. Whereas obviously, if somebody is being beaten, if somebody's being beaten up in front of you and you're pinning that person's arms behind their back, for you to say, well, that was defensive, I was just stopping him hitting anyone, you are part of the offence, and Britain is part of the offence on Iran, as I'm afraid to say are the Gulf states in many ways. The UK, I resigned from the Foreign Office decades ago now, over the UK's role in torture and extraordinary rendition, because I realised then that the United Kingdom was not a force for good in the world, but the United Kingdom was a force for evil in the world. And the United Kingdom has just got worse and worse ever since. And currently, and both we shouldn't forget that the UK was actively complicit in the genocide in Gaza. Almost every single day of the genocide, but I believe possibly every single day of the genocide, the UK was flying surveillance flights over Gaza and feeding the information direct to the Israeli military. The UK supplies weapons parts, continued supplying weapons parts and munitions to Israel, and provided political cover for Israel and was supporting Israel in international institutions. The UK was directly complicit in the genocide, just as the UK plainly has taken a side against Iran. The statements by the UK government where they haven't condemned the American and Israeli attack on Iran, which is plainly, I say, there is no argument that it isn't against international law. It's plainly against international law. And the Americans haven't even really tried to argue it's not against international law. But the UK government has condemned Iran for its strikes on American bases in the region. Again, that's just extraordinary. And I came to the conclusion 25 years ago, I suppose, that the United Kingdom it's a smaller and less important rogue state than the United States. But the United Kingdom is a rogue state. And if you like, the most useful thing I could do with the rest of my life would be to try to destroy the United Kingdom and bring back my own nation of Scotland to be a free and independent country that does not behave like a rogue state. And I think it's very important we do that we build a state committed both to ending the kind of social inequality and the kind of extreme divisions of wealth that I spoke about at the end. The kind of state where if Jim Ratcliffe left Grangemouth, we'd say to him, OK, off you go, and just take it over and keep it running like the Venezuelans did. And the kind of state that would be standing now next to the Spanish Prime Minister, condemning what's happening in the Middle East, not going along with it and aiding and assisting it. So my commitment to Scottish independence has, if you like, just got stronger and stronger and stronger. But how do we get there? That's a great problem. And when we do get there, how do we ensure that a Scottish state doesn't behave like the British state? Yep. How do we get rid of, in an independent Scotland, how do we get rid of neoliberal control of Scotland? I suppose that's an important question. My own view is, and I think you could find plenty of evidence from voting patterns and from opinion polls, that Scotland is an inherently more left-wing country than the UK. Yep. But the social attitudes of people here are different. And I think that Scotland does have a neoliberal establishment. There's no doubt about that. But I think that neoliberal establishment is sustained by the neoliberal establishment of London. Yeah. And I don't think it's on firm foundations within Scotland itself. I have seen, I'm sorry to say, I've seen a tremendous decline in the SNP over that 20-year period, from being a radical party to being an establishment party, to being a party where people are concerned to say, if you like, the politically correct thing accepted by the London establishment and by the newspapers, as opposed to standing up for what's really right in the world, and a party where the impetus towards independence seems to have just gone. You know, where the number of people in senior positions in the SNP who, in my view, have any genuine intention of actually doing anything about independence is virtually nil. It's extraordinarily sad. I think it's appropriate to say that my view on how we achieve independence comes from international law, which is that we are a people in terms of the UN Charter. There's no doubt Scots qualify as a people. We were, we actually had a longer existence as an independent state than the vast majority of European nations, than the vast majority of nations in the world. There was an extant Scottish nation state within its current boundaries, more or less, for 700 years of independence. Over 700 years. So our existence as a people and a nation is not in dispute. And as a people with the right of self-determination, we should determine it. We should exercise that right of self-determination. And it is impossible to believe both that you have the right of self-determination and that you need somebody else's permission. If you have the right of self-determination, you do not need permission from anyone else. You exercise the right of self-determination yourself, independently and autonomously. The notion that you need agreement from London, if you believe that, you don't actually believe you have the right of self-determination. And you don't actually believe you're a nation, if you believe you need someone else's permission to become one. We've been tied into this notion that what we do has to be legal within UK law. We will never become independent legally within UK law. We would never have been granted the referendum in 2014 if London had had any thought that we might win. If you remember, at the time it was agreed, we were about 30% in the polls. You know, they agreed because they thought we'd be humiliated and it would kill it off. That's why they agreed, not with the thought that, oh well, we'll see. You know, Cameron was confident that we would lose. And the fillip that gave, because that resulted in a step change which has never been lost in support for independence. And so independence is now, in the majority of opinion polls for the last couple of years, independence is now firmly established, and it's extremely firmly established within the young as the settled will of the people of Scotland. But the UK is not going to agree to lose our resources. They're not going to agree to lose the oil and gas, the electricity generation from renewables, the water, the revenues from spirits, our farm produce, our intellectual abilities. Human capital is a rather demeaning word, but the ability to exploit our people might be a good way to put it. Their ability to control our trade flows. They're not going to give that up willingly. We're going to have to take independence. And that means that we just have to do it ourselves. Now, there are over 60 states which have become independent from the UK during my own lifetime. I think only in 3 of those was there a referendum. There's no law that says, there's no international law, but nothing that says you have to have a referendum before independence. Personally, I don't think we should. We elect a Scottish Parliament. I think the Scottish Parliament should declare independence. I think that's how you do it. You simply say, we are exercising our right of self-determination, our elected Parliament is declaring independence. And you go into an independence campaign, you go into an election campaign saying that. If elected, we will declare independence. Then you go ahead and you do it. In international law, what most countries take into account in deciding whether or not to recognise a state is whether you have the government which is claiming to represent the state must have actual control of the territory of the state. If you don't have control of the territory of the state, you're not going to get recognised. There's no good, saying, "Oh, we're a government in exile. Please recognise us." That's not going to happen. In declaring Scotland an independent state, we don't know what level of force, what level of violence that would be met with by the UK government. We saw in Catalonia, we saw what can happen when they tried to have a referendum there, where the Spanish government reacted with extreme violence towards civilians. We don't have the kind of National Guard, which the Catalonians have, the Spanish have a paramilitary Guard Civil, which is like a paramilitary, heavily armed and very violent organisation they could use to do that. Here, it's basically the police or the army. That's your choice. What I'm saying to you is that if we go the route, and I think we should go the route, of the Scottish Parliament simply declaring independence, we then have to take to the streets and actually take control of our own country. And and I don't think, I would be extremely surprised if Police Scotland were willing to obey orders from Westminster. Again, I remember policing is one of the things that's devolved. I'd be extremely surprised if Police Scotland were willing to take to the streets of Glasgow and attack. I know they've got quite an orange history, but they, I'm not sure that the level of violence that would be required to overturn a declaration of independence. I'm not sure that Police Scotland would be prepared to go that way. And if they start sending the Metropolitan Police to Scotland to take control of the streets, I'm not sure that's just going to work. I think that's going to get a very fierce reaction from the Scottish people. The other thing they can do is do what Churchill did and put tanks on the streets of Glasgow, and there we have to be prepared to stand in front of tanks. Tanks are a very blunt weapon, basically. They can either start mowing people down in their thousands and shelling and machine gunning them, or they're not much use. I'm not advocating violence. I'm advocating non-violent resistance and taking control of Scotland, taking control of our own streets, taking control of the institutions. And you have to make sure you do it very cleverly and do it properly. When you declare independence, all public office holders the next morning need to be told that you either swear allegiance to the Scottish state or you're out of the job. You need to get rid of them. You can't leave the judges in place who are loyal to the union, for example, because otherwise they'll just produce a judgment saying, oh, in Scottish law this is illegal. You need to be prepared to act ruthlessly and fast, because you're talking of a declaration of independence which is perfectly lawful in international law. There's no reason at all why we shouldn't do it, which would be passed by our own elected parliament, so it's perfectly democratic, but which will be illegal in UK law. And my own view is that anybody who is unwilling to break UK law in order to obtain Scottish independence is not actually a Scottish nationalist. If you're not prepared to break UK law to get independence, you don't believe in Scottish independence. Because playing around at it and waiting for Westminster to agree, you will never, ever get it. Now, that's rather a hard lesson, because most of us think of ourselves as law-abiding individuals. But it's a question of whose law? Whose law is being imposed on the people? Is it the law of the people, or is it the law of the Westminster ruling class? And when the people of Scotland want independence, the people of Scotland deserve and must take independence. In the SNP official mind, all this is going to happen peacefully, and there's going to be a sort of 3-year transition to get all this in place. But even with that, if you ask them, okay, where is the Scottish Foreign Ministry going to be? Which building in Edinburgh is the Scottish Foreign Ministry? They haven't got a clue. If you say to them, where are you going to put 70 foreign embassies? They haven't got a clue. If you say to them, okay, where's the Ministry? What's going to be the Ministry of Defence? They haven't got a clue. There's been no actual planning for independence whatsoever in terms of these practical. And you're right to hone in on the practicalities. But it's, as I say, it's been done. You know, when the Soviet Union broke up, the Baltics all had to get all this in place in exactly this way, and they did. It's doable. It's going to be. There's going to be a period of dislocation when things are slightly chaotic. That's undoubtedly true, and my own view is we need our own currency from day one. You know, we need to move immediately to having a separate Scottish currency. We can't continue using pound sterling, for example. All that's going to need to be put in. In Venezuela that I've just left, because of sanctions, they had a currency that vanished, and they were also banned from all international transactions. You can't. There's almost no way to send or get money from Venezuela. You can't. Banking system. They're not allowed to use SWIFT. The banking systems essentially stopped operating. So they, in fact, came up with their own currency as a digital currency. They still have the bolivars, but they're pretty well valueless because, of course, rampant inflation set in with the sanctions. But every single, even the little guy with a table, literally on the street with a stall, selling coffee to passers-by, they all have a QR code. They all have one of those, and their own currency works almost entirely on digital transaction on everyone's phones now. And it's to get round. It's been their solution to the problems caused by sanctions cutting them off from the international financial industry, and it works. And they went through a period. They went through a very hard period when sanctions first started. And you may have seen 6 or 7 years ago, always used to be all over the news of the shops being totally empty in Venezuela and that kind of thing. Was now the shops all entirely full, and everyone pays almost everything using their own digital currency, because they didn't have the ability to print banknotes. So they brought in a digital currency, which I think there are people, Tim Ridout, I think, and people are working on these kinds of solutions. But there are ways to, I mean, I'm not saying what you're saying are not problems. They are problems, but they are overcomable.
And would the United Nations support us?
As I say, they eventually supported the Baltic states, for example, which declared independence from the Soviet Union. In fact, I think within the European Union, if you count the member states of the European Union, which weren't independent 30 years ago, it's actually quite a lot of states.
We'd have a lot of support.
And we'd have a lot of support from a global south. I also think we'll get quite a lot of support from the European Union, thinking that we will rejoin the European Union. Personally, I'm not actually in favour of rejoining the European Union, but I think the majority of Scots people probably are in favour, even though I'm not. And it's certainly a motive for the European Union to support us, because it brings very high augmentation to the European Union's internal energy resources. And it's a good moment probably to come on to what we've been doing with the United Nations, because I know that this is a contentious view, particularly on the left. My own view is that Scotland is a colony, was colonised, and that Scotland remains a colony. And I don't think that Scotland's active participation in the empire makes it any less a colony. And in that sense, Scotland's in no different position at all from Ireland, where Irish troops and Irish elites participated very actively in the British Empire. But nobody now doubts that Ireland was colonised. And I can see no reason at all why anyone should doubt that Scotland was colonised. We were under military occupation for most of the 18th century. And we are attempting to get Scotland's colonial status recognised at the United Nations, which, if we succeed, will make life much simpler in terms of recognition at the UN, by potentially removing the Security Council veto aspect. It's not an easy thing to do. The United States is not as uniformly, monolithically hostile to the idea of Scottish independence as you might think it is. And the Trump administration is not monolithically hostile to the idea of Scottish independence. One of the things you have to do in doing this kind of lobbying, which is something I got very used to with the Assange campaign, for example, is you have often to try to find allies on a specific issue who are not people with whom you would normally enjoy warm relations. And there were many people on the far right, on the libertarian right, let me say, in the United States, who were great supporters of the Julian Assange campaign and actually were instrumental in the political atmosphere that helped get him out of jail in the end. And so your Tucker Carlsons and your people of that ilk in the States are not naturally hostile to Scottish independence. It's not an idea which fills them with, to which they react with loathing. There are the more traditional right in the United States thinks primarily in terms of NATO and military and is hostile to Scottish independence for that reason. But that doesn't necessarily run through Trump supporters and some of the other bases of Trump's support. I just throw that out as a thought. The global south, the vast majority of countries in the world, undoubtedly are extremely sympathetic to the notion of Scots independence. And strangely enough, and one thing we have found in lobbying in New York and Geneva over the last year, and it feels like we've been at it for longer than that, but we haven't. We've only been at it for a year. Not one person from, and I've spoken to dozens of diplomats from South America, from Asia, from Africa. Not one of their diplomats has ever turned around to me and said, but you were a colonizer, you're not colonized. Not one of them has made that point, or even made any remark that indicates that that's in the back of their mind. I've not had anyone from the global south in the diplomatic world who does not accept the notion that Scotland is a colony. They all see that straight away, which is really good, because that's the main base of support that we need in order to get through the various committees and to the General Assembly and get a General Assembly resolution adopting, not necessarily a resolution, I can't call precise mechanism, but we need the General Assembly to vote to put Scotland on the list of countries to be, states to be decolonised. But it's not, it's the United Nations, it's diplomacy, and it's not quick and easy. Anything at the United, getting any major anything to the United Nations on any, whatever the subject, takes years. It just does, and it takes huge amounts of patience. A lot of it's very personal. You have to get people on side, you have to get, and then they have to convince people in their governments, you have to convince ministers. And of course, you're trying to do it over time, and it's a moving target. So the deputy head of the Russian delegation, the deputy ambassador of Russia to the United Nations, the Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations, and the Serbian ambassador to the United Nations were all people who I spent time with and got to know a bit and convinced, if you like, that not only should they support Scottish independence, they should be helping persuade their governments to support Scottish independence. And then at the end of last year, all three of them got moved to other jobs. And then you have to start again. And that's how diplomacy works. I went to Venezuela largely to support Venezuela at a time when it was under attack by the United States, but also because I'd made good inroads with Venezuela, getting Venezuela to be the sponsor state of Scotland and Scottish independence at the United Nations. But then Venezuela gets attacked and throttled in a way that makes it nervous to do anything that's going to upset the United States. So you're constantly seeking ways and means of persuading people, but then world events knock you back a bit. Now, having been a professional diplomat for over 20 years, this doesn't faze me at all, because this is what I expected to happen. This is why I expect it to take years, because things, just diplomacy does, and things always go wrong, and people move, and world events happen. But so I don't believe it was ever realistic to expect Scotland to be added to the list for decolonisation in a year or two. You know, it's a process which is going to take several years, and that's difficult to get people to, and especially when a lot of it isn't big public events or grandstanding or some, you know, a lot of it is quiet behind the scenes persuasion. Getting people to have the patience to sustain the campaign over the period it takes is tricky. And I find myself saying, you know, it's not my fault. The guy who agreed to do it got moved, and now he's in the embassy in Vienna instead. I need to start again with the next one. It's hard sometimes. It is hard. There have been scores of countries on that list, and the large majority of countries who were on that list have become independent. The ones who are still there, who are stuck for years and years and years and years, are there because the colonial power is not willing to let them go, and the people of the country haven't managed to free themselves, if you see what I mean. Yeah, you could be on the list and stay there. The United Nations isn't going to free you.
Exactly.
The United Nations isn't going to free you, but if you're on the list of countries to be decolonised and you declare independence, then the vote in your favour at the General Assembly is essentially automatic.
Newspapers, the media, all been international owned. Yeah. We've got strong lobbying groups, and we have foreign money paying these lobbyists, especially in Westminster at the moment with what's going on in the Middle East. Yeah. There's a certain country that's pouring money into politics in this country and getting the decisions they want, but the ones we don't want them to give. How do you get round that?
Well, I think it should be illegal for any elected representative, MP, MEP or councillor, to accept money from anybody. It should just be illegal. And that includes it being, you know, accepting research assistants, accepting officers, accepting gifts, accepting something to a consultancy that your son owns or whatever. Basically, they're all paid enough. You know, they don't need to accept money. And you look at Yvette Cooper's, because I haven't talked about the Palestine Action thing I'm into. Yvette Cooper, who did the ban on Palestine Action, received more than £200,000 personally from Israeli lobbyists. You know, 200,000. Why is an MP allowed to accept £200,000? You know, it should be illegal. That's not at once. That's over a period of about 6 years. But all the same, I think that's one thing you do. I think you simply make it illegal for them to accept money from anyone. But there also, the trouble is there are other ways of doing it. You know, you find that they retire from politics eventually, and then they get company directorships and consultancies and what. Massive book fees. I mean, it's something that always fascinates me. As someone who's publishes books, Murder in Samarkand sold, I think, 35,000 copies in the UK. And I received about £42,000 in royalties for selling 35,000 copies. You look at politicians whose books usually don't sell as many as 35,000 copies, and they're getting £400,000, £500,000 advances from the publishers. Now that's a bribe. The publisher's never going to make that money out of their book. But there are just so many ways it works. The obvious ones are directorships and consultancies, and things for their kids or whatever. We need an extremely powerful anti-corruption agency investigating these people, and absolutely firm rules against receiving anything at all.
We've got elections in the next 2 months. If we end up with a nationalist government in Scotland of whatever combination, the same in Wales, and we've already got Sinn Féin in Ireland, and the prospect of an English nationalist government coming up, is there a point at which the UK just self-destructs anyway?
I've always been saying that I think I will live to see Northern Ireland as part of Ireland, and I'll live to see Scottish independence. I was less sure I'd live to see Welsh independence, but I'm more and more hopeful that I'll live to see Welsh, because we're discussing how we bring it about and how we bring it about urgently. And we're all thinking 5 years too long to wait, and you know, we want to get independence for the next 2 or 3 years, which would be great. I mean, would be absolutely wonderful. But I am absolutely confident that 10 years from now, Ireland will be united and Scotland will be independent, and I think Wales may well be independent as well. I think that is what's happening. It's a question of the mechanics and how we make it come true. And can we make it come true because we need to, because people are suffering now? Can we make it come true sooner rather than later? But that we will be there in 10 years' time, I don't have any doubt at all. I really do believe that.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.